I don't see them now, but I want to thank them already because they make it possible that we all understand what is discussed here. Again, I also want to mention this is one of the first bigger events at the Centro Cultural de Universitario de Tlatelolco, and it's actually quite a big responsibility to have an event like this, What's Left, What Remains, on this historical location. Historical in many senses. It's the memorial, the 68 memorial, just inaugurated in October last fall, but also the earthquake took place in '85 at this location, and if you look outside, it always has been a place of very troubled histories, and I think it's it gives some seriosity also to this event. Lukinas Queda, What's Left, What Remains, is exploring the role of cultural institutions and cultural producers in a time where public spaces disappear and public mandates getting transferred to the private sector. I'm not against the support of the private sector. The opposite, very often private sponsorship allows what is no more possible because public resources are vanishing or having also kind of mandates behind them. Consumption at this moment is overruling criticality, and the notion of agency vanishes. And I think it's very crucial being in this place, being a startup event for this cultural center, hopefully leave some encouragement for events to come. What is left not only questions how neoliberalism affects cultures all over the globe, but also asks what's left of the 68 student movement and its impact on society, and also what's left of the Gramscian notion of the artist as organic intellectual, and we will hear more about that this afternoon. The first day will focus on a political and theoretical point of departure, as I mentioned it already. Tomorrow we will focus on investigations by cultural actors and producers, shedding light on what has been hidden, as well of re-evaluating archives, opening closed doors, and unwrapping what seems forgotten. What's left out questions the authority of those writing history and engages in how histories can be told differently. And at the last day, as I mentioned before already, it's a question about what happened at a time of an all-time high of the global art market and the competition for funding between private established and public-run art institutions, which has a crucial impact on how institutions are operated today, but also has a crucial impact on artistic and cultural production at large. This development influences the production of artworks, as I said, but also what is collected by whom and for whom. And what is the mandate of cultural actors and producers today? And what is the role of public art institutions? Whose voice and whose history do they represent? And what remains to be done? We suggest the reconstitution of a space for political criticism and public discourse. The total freedom of liberalized markets, as the late Michael Friedman, professor of the University of Chicago and praised Nobel laureate in economy, called it, is definitely a very different kind of the freedom and liberty as the one thousands of students and workers were demonstrating in 1968, and actually a different kind of freedom and liberty as many of us hope for in this world today. Although we see a certain criticality even in mainstream productions such as Hollywood films, the institutional artistic field stays strangely and surprisingly silent, and we hope with this event we can investigate why that is and what are new potentials for participation. It's my honor today to introduce our keynote speaker for this conference and for today's focus, What's Left, Professor David Harvey. He will talk about the right to the city, recalling Lefebvre's right to the city. He will give us some historical explanations about the root to the problem and the question of participation, or to be more precise, the question about the non-participation, which we can see as well at a place like here, where we see utopian ideas of a master-planned modern city. David Harvey is a geographer and social theorist. He's an anthropologist and a distinguished professor in the PhD program in anthropology at CUNY, New York. David is a leading theorist in the field of urban studies, and the Library Journal called him one of the most influential geographers in the late 20th century. David earned his PhD from Cambridge University and was formerly professor for geography at Johns Hopkins University in the US. He was a Miliband Fellow at the London School of Economics and a Halford McIntyre Professor of Geography at Oxford. His reflections on the importance of space and place have attracted considerable attention across the humanities and social sciences, and I want to add here as well in the field of cultural and artistic production. David reflected already early on the flow of global capital and the disastrous impact of neoliberal economies and deregulated markets for the majority of the people. His numerous awards include the Outstanding Contributor Award of the Association of American Geographers and the 202 Centenarian Medal of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society for his outstanding contribution to the field of geographical inquiry and to anthropology. One of his most recent books include Spaces of Hope, Spaces of Capital Towards a Critical Geography, and, as I said most recently, The New Imperialism and a Brief History of Neoliberalism. And in 2006, he published Spaces of Global Capitalism Towards a Theory of Uneven Geographical Development. But what impresses and influences so many of us is his long-standing capacity of being a radical thinker, as the urban theorist and Richard Sennett called him. Please let us welcome Professor David Harvey.
We live in an age where a good deal of political energy is spent projecting, protecting, articulating a politics around human rights. Now, much of that politics takes the notion of human right in a very individualistic way. And while there are some significant achievements of that politics, there is no way in which you can take that notion of human right and challenge liberal and neoliberal ethics which underpin a lot of what contemporary capitalism is about. There have, of course, been histories of collective rights. The civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s accomplished something on a collective level. We have collective notions of rights, women's rights, indigenous rights, which can also, I think, at the collective level, produce significant changes in our society. The particular right that I wish to talk about this evening is the right to the city, a phrase coined by Henri Lefebvre back at the end of the 1960s. And I want to talk about it because there are now social movements in various parts of the world which are talking this language of the right to the city. And I think it is therefore important to understand what the concept might mean and how we might use it politically. The way that I think about it is guided by a comment as to what a city is by a Chicago urban sociologist from the 1920s, Robert Park. And he wrote this. He said, the city is man's most consistent and, on the whole, his most successful attempt to remake the world he lives in more after his heart's desire. But if the city is the world which man created, it is the world in which he is henceforth condemned to live. Thus, indirectly, and without any clear sense of the nature of his task, in making the city, man has remade himself. Now, if we take Park's notion seriously, it would suggest that the right to the city is not simply about access to the resources that a city contains. It's about the right to remake the city in a different image, to remake the city in such a way that we can remake ourselves, that we can remake our social relations, that we can remake our relation to nature, that we can remake our aesthetic values, that we can remake our daily lives around fundamentally different principles. And it is that sense of having the power to remake the city that immediately makes us ask the question, who is making the city right now? And how are they doing it? And why? Now, historically, there is a very interesting feature about cities. Cities have always been produced through the mobilization of a surplus product. The surplus had to be concentrated geographically, and it had to be concentrated socially. So the whole history of urbanization is about a class or a caste or a ruling elite concentrating a surplus and putting that surplus to work to create an urban structure of some kind. Under capitalism, this connects in another kind of way. Because at the heart of capitalism, as Marx taught us, lies the search for surplus value. Surplus value via producing a surplus product. It works like this. Capitalists start the day with a certain amount of money. They go into the market and they buy means of production and labor power. They put that to work with a given technology. They produce a new commodity, and then they sell it for more money than they started out with. That is the surplus. The surplus is the profit. They then have the problem of what are they going to do the morning after. And the morning after is governed by the simple fact, again as Marx taught us, that the coercive laws of competition force capitalists to reinvest a part of what they earned yesterday in expanding their output. So they need more labor. Where is it going to come from? They need more means of production, more raw materials. Where does that come from? They need new technologies. They also need to find somebody to sell their goods to at the end of the day, so they end up with even more money on the second day, and so it goes on. Now, all of this makes me pose the question, if we look at the history of urbanization under capitalism, how much of it has been about absorbing the surplus product that underpins the surplus value which capitalists seek? Because if capitalists cannot dispose of their surplus product, they find themselves in a crisis. They have no profit. Their capital is devalued. It is lost. What do they do in a crisis? That would point the idea that there is a possible end to crisis through an end to capitalism through a crisis in which they could no longer dispose of the surplus product. and therefore not gain the surplus value which underpins their profit. Now, part of my argument here is that capitalist urbanization has been driven by this need to absorb a surplus product. And in exactly the same way that the path of growth under capitalism has been logistical, going upwards forevermore, so the path of urbanization has followed that. But it has done it in a way where the absorption of the surplus becomes critical. The first case I would mention of this begins in 1848 in France. There was a crisis of capital accumulation. Capital stopped. And because capital stopped moving, workers were unemployed. The workers rose up in revolt, and you had the 1848 revolution, which the bourgeoisie successfully crushed. But then the bourgeoisie didn't know how to put capital back to work. And into that situation rode Louis Bonaparte, who then, in a coup, took state power, set up an authoritarian government, and declared an empire. But Bonaparte knew very well that he could not survive unless he could find a way to put capital back to work profitably. The surplus product had to be absorbed. He came up with all kinds of plans to do this, but the key one was the remaking of Paris. And for that purpose, he brought a man called Haussmann to Paris to rebuild the city. And Haussmann came and said, all right, we're going to rebuild the new boulevards, we're going to change the dynamic of the city, we're going to put capital and labor back to work. And he did this very successfully. His plans, however, were largely inspired by the socialist utopian plans of the 1830s and the 1840s, in particular the plans suggested by the Saint-Simonians and the Fourierists. But Haussmann did something which was very special. He took their plans and he changed the scale at which the urban infrastructure was to be reconstructed. There was an architect called Hittorf who had a plan for a new boulevard. And he showed it to Haussmann. He'd had it in his pocket since the 1840s. He showed it to Haussmann, and Haussmann took one look at it and said, not wide enough. This is only 40 meters. I want it 120 meters wide. And so Haussmann rethought the city as a totality. He annexed the suburbs. He replanned the scale at which urbanization was going to occur. To do this, however, he needed new instruments, new possibilities. And one of those instruments which was crucial to him was a structure of new credit institutions. And these were created in the Second Empire to facilitate the debt financing of the reconstruction of Paris. But as he reconstructed Paris, we weren't only seeing just the boulevards and that, we were seeing a reconstruction of a way of life. Because what was happening was the boulevards were connected to the cafes, were connected to the fashion industry, were connected to a new way of life, were connected to the new department stores. And Paris suddenly became what was called the City of Light. It became a consumerist center. And again, everybody, capital and to some degree labor, were fully employed. So Louis Bonaparte survived by having the surplus product absorbed through the urbanization and the reconstruction of Paris, not simply in terms of its infrastructures, but also in terms of its ways of life. And the commentary from the period is very interesting. It says, this transformation of a way of life was creating a new urban personality, a new kind of urban being. That is, people were being remade as well as the city. But towards the end of the 1860s, things started to go very badly wrong. Suddenly, the new credit institutions blew up. They were overextended. They crashed. The financial backing for this whole system came down. Unemployment re-emerged. Napoleon was desperate. What could he do? So he did what many leaders do in situations of that kind. He decided to go to war. And he lost. And then something curious happened. Because this reshaping of Paris in this dynamic way and the reshaping of the new urban personality suddenly ended up producing the Paris Commune, one of the greatest urban revolutions in world history. How come the Paris Commune came out of all of that? Now, people were interested at that time in this whole question of the new urban personality. You read Engels on the condition of the working class. You read Zimmel later in the century about the urban personality which is connected to, which is now arising. This idea of how people get remade was something which was terribly important to the ways in which many 19th century commentators viewed the urban history. Now I want to jump historically to 1942 in the United States. 1930s was a period of crisis. Capitalists could not find ways to produce a surplus product that would be consumed that was going to give them surplus value. You had the Great Depression, the Great Slump. The answer was, of course, World War II. In 1942, American industry was fully employed on the war effort. But everybody started to worry what was going to happen when the war was over. The United States was in alliance with the Soviet Union. The United States had a very strong left movement in the 1930s. And we know what the political answer was. It was to attack the Reds. It was to go after them through McCarthyism, violent processes of that kind. But the United States had to face the problem of how was industry going to be fully employed after the war. And in 1942, there appeared an article in an architectural journal, which was a lengthy analysis of what Haussmann had done to Paris and how he had done it. A very appreciative article. And the article was by a man called Robert Moses. And Robert Moses in the 1930s had had the argument that one of the ways out of the slump is a massive program of public works, massive reorganization. But the institutions were not there to permit it to happen. But in 1945, the federal government set up those institutions, which allowed new highways to be built, that allowed the suburbs to be created. And what Moses did after 1945 was to do exactly what Haussmann had done. He changed the scale at which you understood the metropolitan process. That is, he re-engineered the metropolis right the way out, almost to Boston. He changed the scale of the urban process. And he violently transformed the urban structures. And I think it's fair to say that the way in which the surplus product was absorbed after World War II in the United States and actually elsewhere by imports and all the rest of it was through suburbanization of the United States. But suburbanization created a whole new lifestyle. And it wasn't only about the highways and the automobiles, it was about the refrigerators, it was about the air conditioners, it was about a completely new suburban way of life. Again, people were being recreated in a different image, in a different kind of way. And it worked extremely well in the 1950s and the first part of the 1960s, but then it began to run into trouble. It ran into trouble because that new lifestyle was empty in many ways. Political protest began to emerge. Jane Jacobs began to criticize this kind of way of re-engineering this urban region. And suddenly we get 1968. Now, 1968 in the United States, and this is something which I think it's very important to realize, was very much a movement of the discontented youth from the suburbs, the white youth from the suburbs. It was also a moment when the feminist movement defined the suburbs as their chief enemy. So politically, the attack of 68 upon the suburban lifestyle was a terribly important aspect. But also, in the late 1960s, the whole process began to run into financial trouble. Just as Haussmann in 1868 had had a crash of the financial institutions, so the financial institutions that supported this process ran into great difficulty at the end of the 1960s. There was an attempt to prop them up, and then in 1973, they all crashed. A huge, huge problem in the property market in 1973. Financial institutions going bankrupt in 1973. New York City going bankrupt in 1975. So suddenly that whole urban process came to an end. And the big question was, what can replace it? How can it be replaced? Let's come forward to the present time. We live in a very peculiar world where, on the one hand, when you go to these very large cities, Mumbai, or you go to Santiago in Chile or somewhere, you'll recognize immediately that we're living in a world that Mike Davis describes after UN Development Report as a planet of slums. A huge, huge concentration of populations which seem to have nowhere to go and have a very hard time making a living. But at the same time, as you come into Santiago or you fly in here into Mexico City, you look down and you see huge building projects all over the damn place. Huge, huge projects. And then when you visit a place like China, you see 20 years of astonishing urbanization. 100 cities have become over 1 million population in China in the last 20 years. Some of them have gone from villages to populations of 7, 10, 12 million people. China has consumed half of the world's cement supplies over the last 5, 6 years on this vast urban project. And if you go to Chile or you go to many other countries and say, where is your prosperity coming from? They would say it's the demand for raw materials from China. It's a demand from China that is a big, big thing. So China has played a very crucial role. And during the 1990s in the United States, there began to be also a big surge, but a different kind of surge of urbanization. We had an incredible increase in property values. Property values went up. People found they could remortgage their property and get a lot of money and consume. And particularly after 2000, this suddenly became a tremendous source of growth in the world, for consumerism in the United States that was based in the way the property market was working. Mainly housing. But again, as happened with Haussmann and as happened with Moses, in order to do that, you needed new financial instruments. And these new financial instruments were debt securitization. You took the mortgages, you packaged them together, and you just sold them to investors around the world. This is the changing scale at which urbanization began to work. The major financial institutions are heavily involved in property development all around the world. There are international property development companies now. A vast amount of the surplus has been going into producing astonishing aspects of urbanization. Look at the pictures from Dubai or Abu Dhabi. In Dubai, you can ski inside of a hotel if you want. I mean, what a ridiculous way to spend money. What a ridiculous way to absorb the surplus. You go around all over the place and find completely ridiculous ways of absorbing the surplus through these vast urban projects. Vast shopping malls. We have a bigger shopping mall than you. Vast towers. We have a taller tower than you. And you're coming unstuck, as it did at the end of the 1960s, as it did with Haussmann, as it did actually in the 1920s. It's just repeat, repeat, repeat. The big question is, where is our 1968? Where is our Paris Commune? And at this point, we don't really have it. Except that, if you ask the question, how many social movements are there around the world which are in some way resisting what this is all about? The answer is a vast number. A vast, vast number. The big question is, in what ways and how might they coalesce? And what might they coalesce around? Let me come back to ask the question, why these revolts after these phases of urban re-engineering? And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the urban re-engineering always involves what we call creative destruction. And the creative destruction is always targeted on those least able to resist. So, in effect, What the working class was trying to do in Paris in 1871 was to retake the city from which they had been dispossessed by Haussmann's works. Because Haussmann sought to expel the working class from the center of the city. Get them out of there, they're troublesome. Besides, they don't pay a very high rent. And we want high rent activities. So Haussmann had expelled them from the city. And in 1871 there was a movement to take it back. Take back the city. Exercise the right to the city. In 1968, when Lefebvre wrote his piece on the right to the city, it was in the midst of a huge fight in Paris over trying to keep the developers from destroying the whole center of the city. There were these pictures of the giants invading Paris, the huge towers coming into the city. And there was this huge resistance by the movement to keep them out. So in many ways, there is a moment of nostalgia in 1968 for the Paris that was being lost. And in the same way, there was a moment of nostalgia in 1871 for the Paris that was being destroyed by Haussmann's works. But that also went with something else, which is a movement not only of nostalgia, but a movement to try to grasp who is producing the surplus and how that surplus is going to be used. It was forward-looking. It said basically, we are the ones who are going to determine how the surplus is produced, and we are the ones in particular who are going to be determined on how it's going to be used. And it's not going to be used to rebuild yet again the city through dispossession. Now, right now, what you see going on are movements of dispossession. In Mumbai, for example, a lot of the slums are on high-value land. Get them out of there. State violence is being used to expel people. If you can't do it by state violence, you do it by other means. Very interesting means which sound like they're very consistent with the idea of human rights. For instance, give poor people property rights over their favela shacks. When they have clear property rights, it is said, they will be able to use those property rights to sort of integrate themselves and become entrepreneurs in the capitalist system. You will release all of their entrepreneurial energies, it is said. You will particularly help them to do that if you give them microfinance, microcredit. You will help them. But what microfinance does is it imprisons you in a debt structure. And what property rights does for you, particularly if you're poor and you live in a very insecure world, it leads you very easily to surrender those property rights to somebody else when you need to cash them in. And property developers know that full well. Give all the favela dwellers in Rio property rights. What a good idea. Then the developers can come in and say, okay, I'll offer you money for your shack. I'll offer you what seems like a lot of money to you. And you will take it because you need it, you're desperate. And those favelas are on beautiful sites, aren't they, in Rio? My guess is in 15 years, you will see wonderful condominiums built on all of those hillsides. In Seoul, they didn't do it that way. The property developers simply hired thugs to go in and take sledgehammers and smash people's houses to the ground. They did it systematically, hillside after hillside after hillside, until somebody really produced such devastating video evidence that this is what they were doing, that even the South Korean government at the time got embarrassed to say, well, maybe we'll do it a different way. So part of what this process is about, of finding the surplus product, is also engaging in this process that I call accumulation by dispossession. Dispossession of ways of life, dispossession of assets, and it is always the poor that get dispossessed. Only recently, for example, have we seen, and it was not published in the United States, I can assure you, it was published in Britain, of all places, a map of the foreclosures that have occurred in American cities over the last year. They are highly concentrated in certain parts of the major cities. And when you parallel that map with the distribution of the African American population, they are almost identical. When you parallel it, as recently in the city I used to live in Baltimore, with what's happening to women who are single heads of households, about 85% of the foreclosures in Baltimore are African American women, single-headed households. What happens to them is they lose their house. Because they are foreclosed, the income tax actually uses the amount of debt which they have somehow or other been forgiven as income, and then demands they pay tax on it. If you were one of those New York investment bankers who designed these securitization systems and these collateral debt obligation vehicles and all these other instruments, you were earning $10 million a year while you did that. And the fact that you lost $20 billion this year simply means you get fired. And you get fired with a golden handshake of $100 million. The head of Citigroup walked away having received, for all the time he was head of Citigroup, something like $10 million a year in income, was given $100 million when he left for ruining the company and ruining the country and ruining the financial system. This is the kind of world in which we live. So what should we think about when thinking about the right to the city? One thing that Lefebvre noticed in the 1960s was that the distinction between the city and the country was disappearing. Yes, it was socially different, but the same processes were beginning to work through in rural areas. You see this in India with special investment zones which are taken in rural areas. You see it in rural redevelopment processes here. In other words, it's taking urbanization and these urbanization processes to the countryside, and it's integrating the countryside in with these urban processes. So the right to the city is about resisting this process, attacking this process. And it's also about taking back control over the surplus product. Who is going to produce it and how it is going to be utilized. Now, one of the things that has gone on under neoliberalization has been a privatization of the surplus. Because in the 1960s, the state was taking a lot of the surplus and using it in its kinds of ways to support capitalism in its way. But what we've seen is a privatization of that. It was a dramatic instance of that, recorded of all places in the New York Times just 3 weeks ago. The city of New Haven has no money. It's reduced taxes to the point where it really cannot invest in new urban infrastructures. The only way in which new urban infrastructures are being constructed in New Haven is by Yale University, which is one of the richest universities in the world. It is rebuilding the city in the way it wants. In New York City, we have a mayor who is incredibly rich. And he's taken over this city government, and we have more development projects in New York City now than have been there since Robert Moses. And Robert Moses, who was once a vilified figure, we now have an exhibition just last year which praised him as the great savior of New York. In the same way that Moses rehabilitated Haussmann, so the forces gathered around the Bloomberg administration are rehabilitating Robert Moses and saying that is the way we can save the city. And that is how we will go. The privatization of urban redevelopment. You have Carlos Slim and the Centro of Mexico, right? Well, why don't you ask him to take over the whole damn country and make it work? He might just as well. That is what Bloomberg may be about to do if he declares himself as a candidate for the presidency of the United States. So, the point I think I want to get to is this. We have to recapture control over the surplus. To do that means we have to recapture state power, and a lot of people are against that as a project these days. We have to recapture many of the institutions, the educational institutions, many of which are operating in a proto-capitalist way. Columbia University in New York taking over large chunks of the city. So there has to be a movement for the right to the city which is about trying to reshape what the urban process is about, which is trying to reorganize, but does so in a way that asks that basic question which comes out of Park's definition. What kind of people do we want to be? Do we want to live in a world of criminality and violence, which, by the way, has to be understood as the privatization of the redistribution of wealth? Do we want to live in that kind of world? What kind of relation to nature do we want? The kind of economy you see being developed in Dubai? What kind of aesthetic? Can we return to the idea that the city should be a work of art, a real work of art? Can we turn to that? Can we restructure the city around that question, that what kind of city we want and what kind of city we need cannot be independent of the question, what kind of people do we want to be? And put those together, and it seems to me you who have a new kind of notion of what the right to the city should be about. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
That they still hang on to the idea that a proletariat, including landless laborers, is going to be the vehicle of transformation. I think we should think about organizing just the dispossessed, a movement of the dispossessed, to take back the city. People who've been dispossessed in rural areas as well as in the city itself. So that's what I would like to think about, and think about organization, think about mobilization. But that's just my suggestion. I don't have the magical answer. If I did, we would be doing it. But there are many questions of this kind, I think, that need to be discussed and debated among the social movements. And I'm very impressed, actually, that over the last 2 or 3 years, more and more people in the social movements that I've come into contact with have gone beyond just being activist for the sake of being activist, and have started to ask some of these broader, bigger questions. And how they answer those bigger, broader questions, I think, is going to determine the answer to your question.
Yeah, I would like to ask if it would be possible that you expand a little bit on your argument about the need of increasing the surplus being directed to the state. I mean, I don't understand how is it in your argument, that is very interesting in general, that you feel that that would be a moment of resistance, especially because of the Chinese case that you were discussing, where precisely the capitalist development is run by the authoritarian state.
Yes. You know, it's interesting. The surplus at the end of the day, some of it is taken away in taxation. There's been an incredible rhetoric over the last 30 years about reducing that. But what the data show in all of the advanced capitalist countries is that the proportion of the surplus that goes to the state through taxation has remained pretty constant since 1970. The only interesting question is, what does the state do with it? And increasingly, the state redistributes that surplus to those who control the state apparatus, which is the upper classes. Basically, in the United States, elections are bought by corporate capitalist class. And in buying elections, they buy political influence. And that political influence means that the money returns to them either directly in the terms of tax breaks, or indirectly by subcontracting much of the state to corporations. So my argument about controlling the surplus has also to be about trying to find ways to take back state power, because you're quite correct. State power in the 1960s was increasingly being used to support capitalist enterprises. And in China right now, it's been used that way. The strong developmental states like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, is used that way. So we have to think of an alternative movement that can actually recapture state power. What I object to is a lot of the politics around which I encounter in various parts of the world that say that the state is irrelevant. Forget it. It's corrupt. Don't bother. And that therefore real change is going to come from civil society and the social movements. My answer to that is, best of luck. I don't think you'll make it unless you have considerable access to state power.
Unfortunately, time moved very quickly, and as all of the speakers are here now, and as David also is staying with us the next 3 days, I hope you have time. Also, if you have further question, you have thought a little bit about what he said. I'm pretty sure David is more than willing to answer your questions you will have over the course of the next days. And I just got proposed that rather than having a break, to start with the next panel, in order to allow, like, we really get into the topic rather than now, like, losing the momentum. So I want to thank David very much to give the grounds for the next 3 days.